My parents gave my inheritance money to my poor brother without asking me. When I confronted them, they said he needed it more than me. At the next family dinner, I revealed something that made Mom drop her glass. Hey everyone, before we dive in, I have a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and ensures you never miss out on amazing videos. Alright, let's get started. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I first noticed something was off. I didn't think much of it at first, just a weird little comment that was probably nothing. But looking back, that was the moment everything changed. We were sitting around the kitchen table, the usual family gathering. My parents, Luke, my older brother, and I, along with a couple of cousins who were visiting. It was one of those rare moments where the house felt alive, filled with chatter and the clinking of silverware. I had just gotten back from a weekend trip, and as usual, the topic turned to me and my exciting new endeavors. There had been a recent inheritance situation, where some money from my grandparents was passed down to me. Money I had no real use for, to be honest, since I'm in a solid place financially. I'd always been good about saving and investing, not flashy with my spending like Luke, who often found himself in a cycle of projects that never seemed to pan out. I mentioned the inheritance casually, trying to keep the conversation light. Yeah, the estate came through finally, so that's all settled. Not that I really needed it, but it's nice to have the security, I said, smiling. My dad gave me this weird, tightly held smile. It wasn't like him to act so stiff about money talk. My mom was fiddling with her coffee cup, looking out the window. And Luke was just Luke, grinning but mostly quiet. That's how it usually went. He'd speak up only when it was absolutely necessary. Then came the oddest thing. My mom glanced at my dad and then back at me before speaking. Well, Luke could really use some of that inheritance more than you, don't you think? I froze. The air in the room seemed to shift just for a moment. What? I said, unsure if I'd heard her right. I mean, sure, but he's doing okay, right? My brother, who was sitting across the table, suddenly stiffened. There was an awkward silence, and he cleared his throat. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting by, but, things are always a bit more complicated on my end. That was an understatement. Luke had always been struggling. At least that's how he liked to frame it. Every time I turned around, there was a new business idea, a failed startup, a new investment he'd poured money into and watched sink into oblivion. It was the same cycle every few months. This was a guy who was constantly on the verge of making it big, but somehow never did. It didn't take much to see through it. My parents, bless them, had always been a little too willing to buy into the narrative. But what really threw me off wasn't what Luke said. It was the way my parents acted. There was this strange, almost apologetic look in their eyes when they said it, like they were trying to justify something to me. The words hung there in the air, but they didn't quite make sense. Look, my dad said after a long pause, we just think Luke needs the money more right now. He's had a tough time getting things together. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Are you saying you gave Luke my inheritance? I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I meant. My mom immediately stood up, her face turning a little red. It's not like that, Asher, she said, her voice flustered. We didn't want him to feel like we were neglecting him. He's been struggling for so long, and we thought it would help him get back on his feet. I could feel the frustration building inside me. This was more than just about money. It was about my entire sense of fairness being upended. I had worked hard for what I had. I'd made sacrifices, made responsible decisions, saved, invested. Hell, I even turned down some opportunities that I knew were too risky. And now they were telling me that my brother, who had a long history of irresponsible financial decisions, needed the money more than I did? It was baffling, but I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to snap, to yell about how ridiculous this whole thing was. But another part of me understood their perspective. They loved Luke. They wanted to help him. But did that really justify taking my share without even asking? Without a word? My emotions were all over the place. Luke, to his credit, looked awkward as hell, glancing between me and our parents. He didn't look ashamed, but there was a definite shift in his expression when he realized I wasn't buying the "I need this more than you" excuse anymore. But he didn't speak up either, just sat there nodding along, letting them handle it. I didn't know what to say next. My parents were clearly uncomfortable, and Luke was either pretending nothing was wrong or he genuinely didn't care. I stood up from the table, walking away from the awkward scene. I need some air, I muttered and left the room, feeling the weight of their decisions settle heavily on my shoulders. It was a lot to process. I spent the next hour pacing around the backyard, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Did they think I wouldn't notice? Was this a one-time thing, or was there more to the story? What was I even supposed to do with this new information? The whole situation felt off. I kept replaying the words in my head. He needs it more than you. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect. It was about how they saw me, how they saw Luke, and why they couldn't seem to treat us equally. But more than anything, it was about what I was going to do next. Because I wasn't going to just let this slide. I decided I needed to confront them soon. I wasn't sure what I'd say or how it would go, but I wasn't going to sit on this. There were too many unanswered questions, and honestly, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on beneath the surface. But that would have to wait until the next family dinner. Update: I should have known there was more to this than my parents were letting on. After that weird conversation at the family dinner, I found myself second-guessing every decision I had made up to that point. Part of me wanted to brush it off, pretend nothing was wrong, and just accept that my parents had acted out of a misguided sense of love for Luke. But something didn't sit right with me. That comment, "he needs it more than you," kept playing over and over in my head. It was too dismissive, too final for a simple family matter. I kept thinking about that moment over and over, every time I sat down to work or when I was trying to relax. It wasn't just the money, it was the way my parents didn't even ask me how I felt, how they assumed they knew what was best for me. I'm not a selfish person, but I've worked hard for what I have. They knew that, and yet they seemed so willing to hand it all over to Luke, with barely a question. It was a couple of weeks after the dinner when I got a glimpse of something that would open my eyes to the whole mess. It started innocently enough. I was over at my parents' house again, this time just to pick up some things I had left there. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but then I overheard my mom and dad talking in the kitchen. I'd been walking up the stairs when I heard my mom's voice, a little lower than usual. "I think Luke will be okay now. He's got the right idea this time. The new business venture looks promising." My first thought was, what new business venture? Luke had been through so many promising ventures, each one more half-baked than the last. The guy had a gift for making things sound convincing, until they inevitably crumbled. I leaned against the wall, trying to keep quiet, but the conversation pulled me in. "He says it's the perfect opportunity," my dad said, "and if he succeeds this time, it'll all pay off. No more scrimping." "Right," my mom replied, "but we still need to make sure he doesn't fall back into old habits. He's got so many debts, and we don't want him to drown." I felt my stomach tighten. So there was a new opportunity, and Luke was drowning in debts. That didn't sound like the man my parents had described when they justified giving him my inheritance. That didn't sound like someone who needed it more than me. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Luke's financial situation was not what it appeared to be. There was something off here. I couldn't shake it. I had to know more. I played it cool at first, letting things simmer for a few days before I asked Luke about this new venture. I tried to make it sound casual, like I wasn't probing, but I had to know what was going on. "Hey man, so what's this new business thing you're working on?" I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter the next time we were both at our parents' house. "Mom and Dad mentioned something about it." Luke looked up at me, his face immediately taking on that familiar look of discomfort, like I was asking too many questions. He shrugged. "Oh, it's just something I'm putting together. Nothing too big. A friend of mine had an idea and we're working on it together." "A friend of yours?" I pressed, trying to keep the tone light. "That's cool. Sounds like you've got something solid this time." "Yeah, well, we'll see." Luke's voice was guarded. "It's early days. I've got a few investors already lined up." "Investors?" Now I was really confused. Luke, with investors? My brother didn't exactly inspire confidence in anyone's cast, let alone people with money. And there was no mention of these investors when my parents had talked about his struggles or his debts. In fact, I was willing to bet that my parents had no idea about this. "So you're doing okay then?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Luke smiled thinly. "Yeah, I'm good. Everything's under control." But the thing is, I didn't believe him. It didn't add up. I kept pushing the conversation in a nonchalant way, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. And the more he spoke, the more inconsistencies I noticed. There were little things that didn't match the picture my parents had painted. The struggling Luke, the one who couldn't get out of debt, the one who was so desperate for the inheritance, was nowhere to be found. That night, when I was sitting alone in my room, I did some digging. I went through old messages from Luke, emails from when he'd been trying to get funding for past projects, and I even checked a few public records. I hate to admit it, but I felt a little bit like a private investigator. But there it was. Luke had been receiving financial backing from a private investor who had been putting significant amounts of money into his business ventures for the past year. I couldn't believe it. My brother, the one my parents had said was struggling, was getting outside help, a lot of it. I was stunned. Everything they had told me about him not having money, about him being desperate, none of it was true. I had been played, and I felt so stupid for not seeing it sooner. But the most frustrating part wasn't just that Luke had kept this from me. It was that my parents hadn't seen through it either. They'd bought into his story, hook, line, and sinker. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to confront my parents. I needed answers, and I couldn't just let this slide. But I didn't want to go into this blindly. I needed to understand the full picture before I said anything. So I waited. The next family dinner, I'd get to the bottom of this, and I wasn't going to let it go. The tension was already building, and I knew this conversation would change everything. Final update. I'd been dreading the next family dinner all week. I knew I couldn't just let it go, but I wasn't sure how this was going to play out. There's only so much you can stomach before you're forced to deal with it, right? After everything I discovered about Luke and the inheritance, there was no way I was going to sit quietly at the table anymore. The night of the dinner arrived, and it started off as typically awkward as it always did. Luke was sitting at the far end of the table. My parents were caught up in a conversation about a recent trip they'd taken, and I was just waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was leading to this moment. The casual chatter felt like a front. Something we were all pretending wasn't happening when we all knew there was this elephant in the room. I think what made it worse was how normal it felt. Everything had been set up to be a regular family gathering. The smell of my mom's lasagna filled the air, and the clink of silverware on plates sounded almost too perfect. The problem was that beneath the surface, everything was a mess. I had been sitting with the anger and betrayal of being excluded from the decision, and I knew it wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about respect, fairness, and being seen for who I was. Not just the responsible one who didn't need help, but the one who had a right to be treated with fairness, like anyone else. After a few rounds of polite small talk, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to ask. "So Luke," I started, my voice calm, but there was something sharp behind it. "How's that new business venture going? Last I checked, you were doing okay, but it seems like there's a lot more happening than we knew about." The second the words left my mouth, the entire table went quiet. I could feel Luke's eyes on me, and for a second, I thought he might not respond. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. My parents, on the other hand, shifted nervously in their seats. My mom's face flushed slightly, and my dad adjusted his glasses, avoiding eye contact with me. "You know, it's a big opportunity," Luke said, his tone more defensive than he probably intended. "A lot of moving parts. You wouldn't understand. I cut him off. "You know, you're right, Luke. I probably wouldn't understand. Because last I checked, you were buried in debt, claiming that you were struggling. But funny thing, when I did a little digging, I found something interesting." I could see the blood drain from my mom's face. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. I let the silence settle before continuing. "Turns out you've been getting financial backing for your little ventures. And not just any backing either. From investors. A lot of money, actually. Funny how you never mentioned any of that, considering how you've been drowning in debt. So I've got to ask, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you tell me?" The table felt like it was holding its breath. My mom put her glass down with a little too much force, and I saw her exchange a look with my dad. Luke was silent, and I could see him trying to come up with some explanation, but none was coming. I didn't want to burden anyone," Luke said weakly, but I could tell he wasn't convinced by his own excuse. His hand was shaking as he reached for his glass of wine. "Oh, so it's a burden now?" I said, my voice a little louder. "Well, I think I'm a burden too, you know. After you took what was mine, the inheritance money that was supposed to be split evenly." The tension was thick. My mom's face was pale, and my dad had gone silent, his expression unreadable. This wasn't the confrontation I'd expected. It wasn't some loud shouting match. It was much more uncomfortable than that. "You didn't need it, Asher," my mom finally said, her voice shaky. "Luke has been through so much, and you've always been fine. We thought we were doing the right thing." "I was doing fine because I worked for it," I snapped, surprised even myself with how forceful I was. "You didn't even give me the chance to decide. You didn't ask if I wanted the money or if I could help Luke in another way. You just decided, without talking to me, that I didn't need it. But now I know why." My mom's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was helping your brother. He's always had such a hard time." "By lying to me? By stealing from me?" I stood up now, feeling the anger surge through me. I had tried to hold it in, but I couldn't anymore. Luke was quiet, his face reddening. He didn't even try to defend himself. I felt this weird mix of betrayal and disgust, like I was seeing him for the first time. I had always thought of him as the underdog, the one who needed my help. But it turns out he had been playing all of us. I didn't want to be that person, the one who came off as vengeful or petty. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was owed something. And I wasn't going to just stand by and let this slide. So I did something I'm not proud of. I turned to my parents, looked at my mom, who was still trying to hold it together, and said, "Well, I hope you enjoy the generosity you showed to Luke, because I just sold my portion of the inheritance money. I gave it to charity." It wasn't just to punish them. It was because I didn't want a cent of it. I had no interest in playing their game anymore. If they thought Luke was the one who needed it, fine. I didn't want any part of it. But the look on their faces, my mom's face, was enough to make me feel a small sense of justice. There was a stunned silence. The dinner continued in a muted way after that, with no more attempts at conversation. Luke didn't even look at me. I felt hollow, but strangely liberated too. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative anymore. If they couldn't see the truth, then that was their problem. I had moved on. The dinner ended, and I left feeling like a weight had lifted from me. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had spoken my truth, and I'd done what was right for me. And as for Luke, I wasn't sure where things stood with him, but I'd learned one thing. Sometimes the best revenge is simply to walk away.